Welcome to the Health Headliner podcast by Tudu Digital. Our content is informational only and not medical advice. Please consult your provider. Now, let's dive into today's headlines.
Okay, so you know how we always think about bone marrow as the place where our blood gets made?
Right.
Like that's what we learned in schools and all the textbooks.
Yeah, the blood cell factory, right?
Exactly. But what if I told you that there might be another, like a hidden backup system for blood production?
Well, that's exactly what some very recent research is suggesting, and that's what we're going to be diving into today.
It's kind of mind-blowing, right? This discovery of blood-forming stem cells, the very things that make our blood, but in the lungs.
Yeah, in human lung tissue, to be precise.
So we're going to get into all the details for you today. We've got two main sources. First, there was this health news article that caught our eye, and then we went straight to the scientific paper itself, published in the Blood Journal.
Of course, had to go to the source.
Exactly. And we really want to unpack this whole thing for you. Why is this finding such a big deal? What exactly did the researchers find? And what could this mean for future medical treatments, especially for things like transplants?
All great questions. And to really grasp the significance of this, we should probably start with a little refresher on why blood is so crucial.
Right, back to basics.
You know, your red blood cells, they're the workhorses, carrying oxygen from your lungs to every single corner of your body.
Keeping us alive.
Literally. And to keep that oxygen flowing, you need a constant supply of new blood cells. We're talking about a massive production operation here. Your body makes something like 200 billion new red blood cells every single day.
200 billion, that's just an insane number. And all this time, we thought that was mainly happening in the bone marrow.
Right, that was the dogma, the textbook knowledge. Bone marrow was the primary site, if not the only site, for hematopoiesis. That's the fancy term for blood cell production.
Right, hematopoiesis, got it. So this idea of finding these hematopoietic stem cells, these master cells that give rise to all blood cells somewhere else in the body, that's a huge shift.
It is, and that's where this groundbreaking research from the University of California, San Francisco, UCSF comes in.
So what exactly did they find in the lungs that's shaking up our understanding?
Well, they found these hematopoietic stem cells right there in human lung tissue. And the thing is, these lung-based stem cells were shown to produce red blood cells, those vital oxygen carriers, but also megakaryocytes.
Megakaryocytes.
Yeah.
And remind us again what those do.
Megakaryocytes are responsible for producing platelets. Those tiny cells are absolutely essential for blood clotting, to stop bleeding.
Right, so we're not just talking about one type of blood cell being made in the lungs, but multiple essential components.
Precisely, and this wasn't completely out of the blue. The UCSF team had some previous findings in mice. Back in 2017, they discovered that lung cells in mice actually produced about 50% of the mouse's platelets.
50%? That's a pretty big chunk.
Yeah, it was already suggesting the lungs might be playing a bigger role than we thought, and then they found even more versatile lung stem cells in mice that could produce all the different blood components. Red blood cells, megakaryocytes, even immune cells.
So after seeing this in mice, the next logical step was to see if the same thing is happening in humans.
Exactly. That was the main goal of this new study. Can human lung tissue also harbor these blood-forming stem cells? And can they actually produce blood components like in mice?
So how did they investigate this in humans? Walk us through the methodology.
Sure. They obtained donated samples of human lung tissue, of course, but also samples of bone marrow and blood. This allowed them to compare the stem cells across these different tissues directly.
Makes sense. You need that baseline, right, to see if lung stem cells are similar to or different from the bone marrow ones.
Right. So they examined a piece of lung tissue about the size of a golf ball, and within that tissue, they identified stem cells that looked very much like the hematopoietic stem cells found in bone marrow.
So they found these cells that looked the part. But you said earlier there was something surprising. What was unexpected about what they found?
Well, the surprising part was how many of these stem cells they found in the lung. The density, the number of these cells, was comparable to what you find in bone marrow.
Really? You'd expect the bone marrow to be packed with them, right?
You would, but this suggests that these hematopoietic stem cells are a regular fixture in the lung, not just a few stragglers.
That's a pretty big deal. So they found these cells, they looked right, but looks aren't everything. How did they actually confirm these cells could function like blood stem cells?
Good point. To test their function, they did experiments in petri dishes. They took stem cells from both the lung and bone marrow and gave them the right signals to mature and develop into different blood cells.
Like coaxing them along, right, to see what they could become.
Exactly. And the lung stem cells, they performed beautifully. They were able to produce blood cells just like the bone marrow stem cells.
Wow. So they not only look like blood stem cells, but they can actually do the job.
Yes. And there was another interesting difference. The lung stem cells tended to produce more red blood cells and megakaryocytes, those platelet makers, while the bone marrow stem cells were more inclined to produce immune cells.
That's fascinating. So maybe different locations specialize in different types of blood cells.
That's a possibility they're exploring. They even took this a step further. They introduced human lung stem cells into mice that were lacking their own blood stem cells.
Okay. What happened?
The human lung stem cells were able to restore bone marrow function in those mice.
Really? So they weren't just working in a dish, they were actually functional in a living organism.
Exactly. It really highlights the potential therapeutic value of these lung stem cells.
Okay, so we know they're there, they look right, they act right, and they can even restore function in mice. But how do they know these cells actually belong in the lung and aren't just passing through from the bone marrow?
Right, we need to be sure they're residents, not tourists.
Mm-hmm.
So they took a closer look at the lung tissue and found these hematopoietic stem cells nestled between blood vessels. And the way they were arranged, it looked very similar to how they're organized in bone marrow.
Like they had their own little neighborhood in the lung.
Exactly. They weren't just floating around randomly. They were integrated into the lung's structure.
So they really do seem to live and work in the lung.
That's the conclusion. And now, let's talk about the implications, especially for medical treatments.
Yeah, especially transplants. You can't talk about stem cells without thinking about transplants.
Absolutely. So think about bone marrow transplants. Typically, you collect stem cells from a donor's blood.
With the assumption that those are bone marrow stem cells, right?
That's right. But here's the kicker. The UCSF team analyzed those collected stem cells. And guess what?
Why?
Nearly 20% of them had the characteristics of lung-derived stem cells.
You're kidding. So what we've been calling bone marrow transplants might already include a significant chunk of lung stem cells.
It seems so, which means the lungs might have been contributing to the success of these procedures all along without us even knowing.
That is mind-blowing. So what are the broader implications of all this? Professor Looney, the senior author of this study, had some thoughts, right?
He did. He pointed out that this could be a major second source of stem cells, especially important for conditions like leukemia, where bone marrow transplants are so critical. Having a backup source could be a game changer.
Like a safety net, right? If your bone marrow is compromised, the lungs might step in.
Exactly. This could also lead to new and improved transplant procedures, maybe even less invasive ones.
The article also talked about this emergency reservoir idea. Can you explain that a bit more?
Sure. The researchers believe that these lung stem cells might be like an on-demand system. When your body needs more of a specific blood component, like platelets for clotting or red blood cells for oxygen, the lungs could ramp up production.
Almost like a rapid response team localized in the lungs.
Yeah, exactly. And it makes you wonder, why would the lungs need this ability?
Right. Good question.
Well, the lungs are constantly dealing with blood flow and gas exchange, right? So maybe having a local source of blood cells is advantageous, a way to respond quickly to any changes or problems.
Makes sense. But we've got to be realistic. There's still a lot we don't know about this, right?
Of course. It's early days. One of the big questions is whether bone marrow and lung stem cells might have different specialties. Like, are lung stem cells better suited for treating certain conditions?
Yeah, more research is definitely needed. What about the other experts? You mentioned Dr. Katharina Conrad.
Right. She was the first author of the paper. She emphasized that these lung stem cells are reliably present, and they can actually produce blood cells. It's not just a fluke.
Solid confirmation. And Professor Looney also mentioned this idea of complementary roles for the lung and bone marrow.
Yes. He suggested that the bone marrow might be like the steady, everyday producer, while the lungs are the on-call emergency backup.
That's a really compelling picture. So as we wrap up, what's the big takeaway for our listener?
I think the main takeaway is that we may have had this whole other source of blood stem cells all along, right there in our lungs.
And we never knew. It really changes how we think about where our blood comes from.
It does, and it has huge implications for how we treat blood disorders and how we approach transplants in the future.
Plus, it makes you wonder what other hidden backup systems our bodies might have. What other surprises are waiting to be discovered?
Absolutely. This discovery really underscores how much we still have to learn about our own biology.
So that's our deep dive for today. the surprising discovery of functional blood stem cells living in our lungs. Thanks for joining us as we explored this fascinating research. Who knows what we'll uncover next?
Stay tuned.
Thanks for tuning in to the Health Headliner podcast by To Digital. Like and subscribe for more health news and breakthroughs. Stay healthy and informed. See you next time.